Good morning, it's Friday the 28th of August 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. I'm Pete Fairbairn, I'm the host of the show, and as always, I'm joined by one of Australia's top sports journalists. Today, very happy to have Courtney Walsh from The Australian on the line. How are you, mate?
Yeah, very good, Pete. Going okay down here in Melbourne. We're about 8 weeks into a lockdown and probably 4 weeks into the harsh lockdown, and the numbers are encouraging. So fingers crossed, in a couple of weeks people are out and about or starting to get out and about.
Fingers crossed, absolutely. And of course, our thoughts are with our mates down in Victoria. Hang in there. Hopefully only a couple of weeks to go. Well, the premise of the show is pretty simple. We get up bright and early, read the newspapers, or in Courtney's case, help write them. We find the biggest stories and then we discuss them here. 5 of the biggest stories making waves in the world of sport. And we're going to start in the AFL with a story from Andrew Wu in the Sydney Morning Herald. He's looked at the reason why GWS Giants coach Leon Cameron is yet to sign a new contract. He's agreed an in-principle agreement on a 2-year extension. However, with his team not playing great football at the moment, there has been some speculation that perhaps somebody like a Ross Lyon could be thrown into the mix and maybe Leon Cameron's tenure at the Giants could come to an end. We're reporting that the delay in putting pen to paper, despite the fact that it actually raises more speculation on Cameron's future, it's actually more due to the uncertainty with next year and seeing how they can crunch the numbers as a football club to make the 37% cut to their football department spending cap, how they can spread that around amongst the coaching staff, and that Leon Cameron actually being fairly selfless there and doesn't want to sign his deal until he knows exactly what that football department is going to look like in 2021. But just really on the surface here, Courtney, is it ridiculous to even be speculating on the future of Leon Cameron's role as coach in the first place anyway?
No, look, I don't think it's ridiculous to be speculating about it if you've got some reasonable information as to whether something's afoot. And we should see that the Giants made the grand final last year. They were widely seen to be a contender this year. They've had such a talented list as the players have matured, after the early years of being drafted and coming through. So you've got players who should be at the peak of their powers in a team that made a grand final last year and expected to contend this year, sitting in 11th, must win this week against Fremantle to have any hopes of making the 8. Now, I still think they can make the 8. I think we saw some better sides in the second half last week. But if Leon hasn't actually signed the contract, well, then, of course, there's going to be some speculation. Now, I think he's had a great record, and I don't see how his record would be necessarily any different to someone like Ross Lyon, who took the Saints to 2 grand finals and also Fremantle to a grand final, but didn't quite get those clubs over the line. I think the backing of Shepherd and Matthews is significant, and I don't see any reason why it won't happen. It's a really difficult time, though, for coaches across the competition and for clubs across the competition. We've seen some very good staff go this week. We've seen other acts of selflessness from coaches. Chris Scott forewent his salary at the start of the lockdown because he knew that other assistants weren't earning as much. Leon's move is, I think, wise. I'm sure there'll be cuts across the board.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Obviously, you look at the Adelaide Crows, they had their colours lowered in an AFL grand final, and perhaps the next 2 years we're expected to perform a lot better than they have. And some would say that maybe you do have to strike while the iron's hot, and if things aren't working, you make a change before it starts to become where that football club is actually at. That being said, Cameron's record is very, very good with the Giants. Yes, he hasn't delivered them that elusive first premiership, but he has consistently got them to the latter stages of the season. It's an extremely talented list, and very interested to see whether that football club plays finals in 2020. Our second story today comes from yourself in The Australian, and it's a really interesting one as well. Caught my eye with Western Bulldogs coach Luke Beveridge, who's never backwards and coming forwards, let's be honest. He's warned the AFL to stop making up rules on the run after 2 controversial decisions at the tribunal this week. He described the inconsistent interpretation and sanctioning of sling tackles in 2020 as a dog's breakfast after Geelong's Luke Dalhouse, who will play against the Bulldogs tonight, and also Port Adelaide's Sam Powell-Pepper had 1-match suspensions for dangerous tackles overturned at the tribunal on Tuesday night. Obviously, the Dogs, of course, lost Hayden Crozier for a week earlier this season when his appeal for a similar tackle and a 1-match ban was dismissed. Is Luke Beveridge right here, Courtney? Is the tribunal and its lack of consistency a dog's breakfast?
It's an interesting one. It's certainly, look, the tribunal sees and assesses different angles to what the general public see. And having sat through some of them, it can be painstaking at the process that the players go through in terms of trying to get themselves off, or the AFL, indeed, the AFL Council, Jeff Gleeson, goes through in terms of trying to penalise them. So there's a lot that he's seen in the tribunals that is not seen generally in public. So for there to be differences in penalty and sanctions, that will sometimes occur, and every case is slightly different. The Crozier incident is different to I suppose, the two that we saw this week involving Dalehouse and also Sam Powell-Pepper out of Port Adelaide. But it was clear that the decision was made to try and penalise these tackles at the start of the year. Any potential for danger, particularly on a sling tackle, it seemed pretty evident after there was an outcry over Sean Burgoyne getting off in the first round, and then it seemed like there was a real crackdown. So that's curious. The other, I suppose, curious nature of the tribunal this week was in terms of the staging cases involving Dylan Grimes and his teammate, who's just slipped my mind at the moment. But both were let off those sort of incidents as well. So again, a change in interpretation. I suspect you can never know exactly where we'll go in a tribunal hearing. It's been interesting to be, sit through them and you go, oh, I think the prosecution's in front here at half time. Completely different result by the end of it. So, look, Beveridge, as a premiership coach, won a sixth in the competition. I'm glad he speaks his mind, and I think it's certainly worth considering what he says. But for mine, I think there'll always be inconsistency.
And just really quickly on this topic, he talks about he thinks that cases should be judged on intent rather than impact. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Look, I agree with that. I think that if you consider the impact of an incident, so whether even if it's a slight bump and someone gets hurt, look, for mine, it has to be the intent. We don't punish actions, I think, criminally based on accidents or injury. It's the intent to do it. That's always a key part of cases, and I don't see why it should be any different in football. I hate that move. I think it's the wrong move.
We turn from the 18-man code to the 11-man code with the A-League Grand Final, of course, this weekend. Sydney FC taking on Melbourne City. They were the two teams who finished in the top two spots on the ladder before the final series. So justice being served a little in that sense. And Sydney FC, this remarkable situation where pre-COVID, they were almost impossible to beat and absolutely flying at the top. They came back after COVID, couldn't win a game to save themselves, went into the semi-final against the Perth Glory with all sorts of pressure on them, and having won the minor premiership, then being the team in the worst form in the competition. But they comfortably dispatched Perth Glory. Milos Ninkovic telling Sydney Morning Herald's Dominic Bossi that we wanted to prove a point. Everyone was talking about how we're not good enough anymore. But yesterday, everyone was switched on. And when we're switched on, no one can beat us. It was annoying that people were talking about our dip in performance. Everyone started talking like we weren't good enough and that we'd forgotten how to play football. We know that we have a very good squad. We didn't forget how to play football, and I think we showed that yesterday. If Sydney FC were to win the grand final on Sunday night, they would become the most successful team in the 43-year history of Australian national domestic football by winning a fifth title. Ninkovic has played two grand finals with Sydney for 2 wins. He'll be looking to keep that perfect record intact. What makes Sydney FC such a successful club? And will they secure the premiership this Sunday night, Courtney?
Well, look, first, before we get to that topic, I've got to say, I love the fact that he's annoyed by people speaking about the club and also annoyed by what he's reading in the papers, for example, because we always hear athletes and coaches say, oh, no, that's white noise. We don't hear what's going on outside the club. Clearly, they listen. Clearly, they're driven by, sometimes that a good coach will often find an article, show it to a paper and say, use this as your motivation to get through. It's always an interesting byproduct. And I'm also rapt that we're at the final. I think that's a really, really good thing given where we were and in the initial dramas of trying to get the season back restarted. It's a fantastic thing. To have that sustained success, I think, is incredible. And clearly success breeds success. Even that belief that we've just discussed in terms of going through 4 matches of not winning, to be able to turn it on like they did this week is important. And I just think the inner belief, the inner consistency, what's happened in the past does drive the future. in a lot of regards in terms of culture. And I think that's been a big factor for Sydney.
For what it's worth, I think Melbourne City have had a fantastic season as well. We know that football club has struggled over the journey at times to capture the hearts and minds of the Victorian public, and obviously a lot of scorn sent their way through the fact that they are owned by the City Football Group, the richest football group in the world. But it would be great to see them win a maiden premiership as well. That one's Sunday night. You can catch it live on Fox Sports. But as we spoke about on the show yesterday, you can also watch it on a 2-hour delay on the ABC if you've somehow got the ability to stay away from social media for that time. Our penultimate story today, we turn to the NRL and Sammy Phillips, friend of the show in the SMH. He's got some quotes from Sydney Roosters coach Trent Robinson, who's called on NRL clubs to spend more time developing coaches rather than simply sacking them as dispensable commodities. We saw Anthony Seibold finish up at the Broncos on Wednesday. He joined Stephen Kearney, Dean Pay, Paul Green and Paul McGregor as the 5th NRL coach to leave their club this season. Robinson said the needs of the job in the last decade have grown. Rather than just attack and defence, there's a lot more scrutiny and there's very little education other than playing rugby league that goes into coaching our sport. How do we develop that? As I said, the clubs need to take responsibility. They don't know how to develop coaches for the most part. All they do is hire a coach, and if they don't do well, they get rid of them quite quickly. Courtney, we saw it in the AFL last year with a number of coaching changes, 5 coaches sacked in the NRL this year. Do sporting organisations need to do more to develop the coaches, or does the buck simply stop with them?
No, and it's interesting when we were talking about Leon Cameron just before, who made a grand final last year, has had his team in finals for the 3 years before that, and looks, he's still a chance of certainly that happening again this year, and he's under pressure in the AFL. I think you only need to look to last night's AFL match between Richmond and West Coast to see a coach in Damien Hardwick, who has won 2 of the last 3 premierships as a team that's clearly the team to beat this year in their premiership defence. Now, had there been this ruthlessness, had there not been a willingness to stick by Hardwick in the early years, he would have been gone by 2012. They had a horrendous start to his tenure, losing 9 games in a row. The next year, they didn't come good. It wasn't until 2014, 2015, they put some other people in around him, and he's flourished as a coach. And then they have 2 premierships. That may not have happened had they been impatient in getting rid of him. We see, certainly in the AFL, we see former coaches such as Alan Richardson coming in to stand aside, Simon Goodwin. We've had succession plans. There are high-level coaching, I suppose, degrees that coaches go through to try and get enough backing and enough background. So there are certainly ways in the AFL that coaches are being developed and supported. But we do see the flip side. Brendan Bolton, of course, goes, and then Carlton looks like they're going to come good after the hard work he put in. So it's, you can understand a club being impatient for success, fans being impatient for success, but sometimes coaches do need 4 or 5 years. I guess the trick is, after 5 years, do you let them go or do you keep them? It's a hard one. And it's been a really interesting season in the NRL to see coach after coach after coach go, particularly given the COVID challenges of 2020. It's sort of seen from AFL land that coaches are pretty much protected this year because of that, whereas in the NRL it's been ruthless and all systems go.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and we often hear about kind of development and coaches traveling over to a Harvard or a Yale or an Oxford to do kind of courses in whether it be emotional intelligence. I know Alan Richardson used to go to Bali and do kind of yoga and all sorts of things. Different coaches do different things to try and develop themselves. But it's an interesting thought whether clubs can or should be doing more in that space around, potentially around the actual, tactical side of the games and the actual technique side of coaching. Our final story today, and we're kind of drawing from a few different stories here to discuss what is the biggest story in world sport at the moment. There's your story in The Australian talking about Naomi Osaka withdrawing from the WTA event in New York. She will be able to now play with that match being rescheduled. Great column from your colleague Will Swanton as well. When athletes don't play ball, the world may change. And we'll drop the links, of course, in the Twitter notes. And also a story from Sportico, which just provides the latest update on NBA players voting to continue the playoffs. The background here is that the NBA postponed Thursday's playoff games after Wednesday's fixtures were also called off after the Milwaukee Bucks player walkout in protest of the shooting of Jacob Blake. Blake, a black man, was shot 7 times in the back by police in Wisconsin near Milwaukee. We saw that Naomi Osaka pulled out of her match, and then the ATP and WTA subsequently announced it was pausing play at the Western and Southern Open on Thursday. We saw 7 NFL teams cancel practice. Major League Baseball, WNBA, MLS all had games postponed or cancelled as well. I love this quote from Will Swanton, or this line from Will Swanton in his column today. Sport and politics don't mix. What a crock. They do now. Stop shooting black people. Prosecute the bloke who did, or we're not playing. There's your mix. Naomi Osaka said before, I'm an athlete, I'm a black woman, and as a black woman, I feel as though there are much more important matters at hand that need immediate attention rather than watching me play tennis. So we've seen, with the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen sport increasingly become linked to this movement. Overall, Courtney, has sport evolved to the point that now it can be extremely powerful in driving change in all walks of life?
Oh, look, I think so, but I think it's also worth noting, who says sport and politics have never mixed? We've seen, the rebel tours to South Africa during the apartheid eras, and the apartheid era, and the criticism that drew, but also the fact that it did shed some light on it, and hopefully led to some period of change, sort of in that country in the early 90s. Billie Jean King pushing for equal rights in terms of women's prize money, or at least for women to be paid back in the start of the 70s. That clearly was the start of a significant movement in women's sport, to the extent that we now have 9 of the top 10 women's athletes in terms of payment of tennis players, but hopefully that's spreading further worldwide. So there's always a history of, there had not always, but there's certainly been a history of politics and sport mixing. Peter Norman on the podium in the 1968 Olympics alongside 2 great American athletes. It's mixed. It really does frustrate me when people say that you stay in your lane, you can't discuss. It's almost as though because you're an athlete, you don't have a brain and you're not allowed to think. Certainly, clearly, some of these people are highly educated, very well spoken, articulate, and think about things deeply. So I'm very glad to see that someone like Naomi Osaka, who really, had an introspective view of where she stood, what she was for. She was quite shy and pressed, but she's clearly in the last 6 months speaking about these matters. It's worth noting that she went to Minneapolis in the midst of the protests about George Floyd earlier in the year, his death, not publicly, but just she was there, quietly trying to understand what was going on. Coco Gauff being called on to speak at a rally as well in terms of Floyd. So this has been happening for a while. I think a really significant day, though, yesterday, the fact that players said, we're not prepared to take this. We can walk away if we want, and we can use our profile, our organisations, for a greater good than simply pushing the sport itself. I think it's great to see.
Yeah, well said. And I think to your point, there's always been athletes with strong views, and there's always been a mix to a degree of politics and sport. What we've seen in recent years, of course, athletes now have platforms that they can say and present those views a lot more freely. They don't need to rely on somebody wanting to interview them or listen to those views. What we're seeing increasingly now, and credit must be paid, is sporting bodies and organisations actually recognising the athletes as the number one valuable commodity and valuing their views and opinions and standing beside them. And I think the NBA, the WTA and ATP tours, how they've responded to this as well, that's a real change from what we might have seen in the past. So I think that's the most exciting element of this from my perspective. Courtney, before I let you go, I just need to acknowledge that today is the 50th episode of the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. I'm having an absolute blast making the show. I've been really humbled by the number of people watching and listening, the number of people who've reached out, people I know, people I don't know, people I haven't spoken to in a long time. And that wouldn't have been able to happen without the caliber of guests I've had on the show. So I want to quickly shout out to all 18, Adam Pangili, Beth Newman, Brad Walter, Christy Doran, Courtney Walsh, Darren Parkin, Jim Tucker, Julian DeStoop, Julian Linden, Natalie Ioannidis, Paul Cully, Phil Lutton, Sam Bruce, Sam Phillips, Sean Maloney, Tom Decent, Vince Rigari, and Wally Mason. Thank you so much to all of you for giving up your time and supporting the show. Of course, you can catch it via Twitter, on Facebook as well, and also via your podcast app. I'm going to be taking a week off just to refresh the batteries before we come storming home into the NRL and AFL final series. And with that in mind, I want to thank Patrick Skeen, who's sent me a copy of his book, The Big O, The Life and Times of Olsen Filipaina. That's certainly going to be something that I'm going to rip into with the extra time I have over the next week. But Courtney, It's great having people like yourself on the show. And as always today, you've provided such valuable insight and opinion. Really, really grateful for you giving up your time.
No, absolute pleasure. And if, say, Tim Payne, the Australian cricket captain, was sitting alongside you, he'd say, well done on the 50. Now knuckle down and get your century.
Yeah, I like that, mate. Well said, and very much looking forward to catching up with you, hopefully in person up here in Queensland. If you had to come up into that hub environment, that would be superb. Thanks so much to all of you for watching and listening to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. We'll see you again in 1 week's time. Cheers.